On a bitterly cold New Year's Eve in the heart of Manhattan, a young orphaned girl stood trembling beneath the awning of an upscale bar, holding nothing but a basket of roses soaked through with snow and the old gray wool scarf her mother had left behind before she died. She'd no home to return to, not a single coin in her pocket, and her only younger brother was lying in wait for a heart surgery she'd no idea how she would ever afford. Then, in the middle of that snowstorm, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce slowly came to a stop in front of her, and from inside stepped a man whose name all of New York feared to speak, the most powerful boss in the underworld, a man who possessed billions of dollars and a heart colder than winter ice. Rosalind thought she was about to come face to face with someone dangerous, but what she didn't know was that 9 years earlier, on a rainy night in Chicago, one small act of kindness she had accidentally shown to a blood-soaked stranger in a dark alley had quietly saved a life and changed the fate of an entire empire. Before the story begins, I'd truly love to know, where in the world are you listening to this story from? If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like so I'll know you're here with me. Don't forget to share this story with the people you love, because somewhere out there, someone may be needing a small ray of hope to believe in kindness again. And finally, please press the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that we can continue walking together through many more moving and meaningful stories on the road ahead. The bitter wind off the Hudson River came racing back through the streets, driving thick snowflakes into Rosalind's pale face like hundreds of icy needles. She tried to keep her footing, one thin hand clutched tightly around the handle of her wicker basket. But her legs had long since gone numb and no longer obeyed her. A sudden fit of coughing rose from deep in her chest, violent enough to make her whole body tremble. She lifted a hand to cover her mouth, trying to hold it back, but the coughing came in waves, one after another, as though it meant to tear apart the fragile cage of her chest beneath the thin wool sweater. Her ash-gray eyes blurred with tears, not from pain, but from the helplessness so desperate it seemed to tighten around her heart with every passing second. And then her knees gave way. The basket of roses slipped from her freezing fingers and tipped onto the white snow. Deep red petals spilled out and scattered across the ground beneath the glimmer of the streetlights, looking like crimson tears someone had wept into the heart of a merciless winter night. Rosalind collapsed beside the basket, both bare hands braced against the snow so cold it seemed to cut into the bone, her chestnut brown hair falling loose across half of her deathly pale face. She tried to push herself up, but whatever strength she had once possessed seemed to have left her long ago. In that moment, her mind drifted back to that very morning, when weak sunlight had filtered through the small window of the damp rented room where she was staying. The old telephone had rung, and the warm voice of Dr. Thompson, heavy with worry, came through from the other end of the line. He was the cardiologist who had followed Oliver's condition for the past 2 years at Mount Sinai Hospital, and today he had called with the news Rosalind had been dreading for far too long. Oliver's condition had worsened faster than expected, the doctor said. The boy's heartbeat was no longer stable, and if the surgery wasn't performed within the next 2 weeks, he couldn't promise what would happen. Rosalind had stood motionless by the window for a long time after the call ended, her hand clenched so tightly around the old phone that her knuckles turned white. $180,000. A number that felt farther from her now than the stars above the Manhattan sky. 3 years of wandering the freezing streets selling flowers, sleeping in 24-hour laundromats, or in the corners of old apartment hallways, and she had managed to save not even $4,000. And now, on the final New Year's Eve of the year, Rosalind was kneeling on the frozen snow, tears slipping silently down cheeks already numbed by the cold. She thought of Oliver's clear green eyes, of the shy smile that touched his face whenever she came to visit, of the promise she had whispered into his ear when he was still very small, that she would always be here, that she would never let him be alone. But what did that promise mean now, when she couldn't even stand on her own feet, when she didn't have a single coin in her pocket, when this glittering city didn't hold even one open door for her? Rosalind bowed her head a little lower, her shoulders shaking, whether from the cold or from the grief inside her. She couldn't have said. At that exact moment, between the shriek of the wind and the distant cry of traffic, she heard footsteps on the snow, step by step, slow but steady, drawing nearer to her, and then a pair of polished black leather shoes, expensive in a way that was impossible to mistake, stopped directly before her. She hadn't even had time to lift her head and see who had come, when a low, cold voice, carrying the unmistakable weight of power and darkness, sounded above her. Are you all right? Rosalind struggled to lift her head, her hair soaked with snow falling loose along both sides of her pallid cheeks. Her ash-gray eyes were blurred by the freezing mist and tears, but she still tried to make out the face of the man standing before her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black overcoat that fell to his knees, tailored with flawless precision, the collar turned up to hide part of his sharp lower jaw. Beneath the weak yellow light of the street lamp, filtering through the snowfall, she could only catch the dark blue depth of his eyes as they looked down at her, neither warm nor hostile, but so cold and distant that her heart tightened inside her chest. She tried to open her mouth to say that she was fine, to say that she didn't need help, but her throat was raw and dry, and her voice had shattered in the violent fit of coughing from moments before. Rosalind could only shake her head very faintly, her purple lips trembling in the wind. The man said nothing more. He only cast a brief glance toward the Rolls-Royce parked a few steps away, then gave the slightest nod. Almost at once, a powerfully built man with closely cut hair and a stern face stepped out from the passenger side and came toward them. This was Marco, the man's trusted bodyguard, a man who had served the family for more than 15 years and understood every glance from his employer without needing a single explanation. Marco bent down and gently took hold of Rosalind's freezing arm, his deep voice carrying calm professionalism as it reached her ear. "Please come with us, miss. It's far too cold out here." Rosalind wanted to resist, wanted to wrench herself free and run, but her body was so exhausted that even fear itself had begun to fade. She let Marco guide her toward the luxury car, her hand still gripping the handle of the spilled rose basket, as though it were the last thing left to her in this world. The car door opened, and a wave of warmth and the scent of expensive leather rushed toward her. Rosalind sank into the soft leather seat, and her whole body seemed to melt beneath the heat rising through it. The mysterious man was already seated across from her, one leg crossed over the other, both gloved hands resting lightly on his lap. He wasn't looking at her, only watching the blurred flow of traffic beyond the window in silence. Rosalind curled into the corner of the seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Then suddenly she realized that a large shape was lying still in the rear compartment. A Belgian shepherd with a sleek coat of brown and black lay quietly there, its ears raised high and its sharp amber eyes fixed intently on her. Rosalind caught her breath. She had seen dogs like that before in films about the police, working dogs trained with strict discipline, animals that could become dangerously unpredictable with strangers. But instead of growling or showing aggression, the dog slowly rose to its feet and came toward her with soft, silent steps. Then it lowered its head and rested its warm muzzle on Rosalind's lap, so gently that she could barely feel the weight of it. Its amber eyes lifted to meet hers with a tenderness so startling it hardly seemed real, as though it had known her for a very long time. In the seat across from her, the man turned his head sharply. For the first time since she had entered the car, his cold expression revealed a shock he couldn't conceal. He looked at Duke, then back at Rosalind, his dark brows drawing together slightly. In the 3 years since the day he had brought Duke home after the dog was injured and forced into retirement from the New York Police Department, Duke had never trusted anyone except him. He growled at house staff, remained wary even of Giuseppe, his longtime elderly advisor, and allowed no one to touch him except his owner. And yet now, he was quietly resting his head in the lap of a girl he had never seen before, as though nothing in the world could be more natural. Raphael tilted his head slightly, his gaze settling on Rosalind's pale face, and then dropping to her half-closed ash-gray eyes. A strange feeling rose unexpectedly from somewhere deep within his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Those eyes, that rare ash-gray color, he had seen this exact shade somewhere before, on some rainy night many years ago. But before Raphael could follow that vague sensation far enough to find its answer, Rosalind's head had already fallen against the seat, her long lashes lowering, and she slipped into unconsciousness in the warmth of the luxurious car, while the snowstorm raged through the night outside. The Rolls-Royce glided silently through the snow-covered streets of Manhattan, before finally coming to a stop in front of a soaring skyscraper of glossy black glass that reflected the city lights. It was Santoro Tower, a 60-story monument standing over the financial district, the symbol of the power and wealth of an empire that had endured for 3 generations. Raphael gave Marco a slight nod, and the loyal bodyguard carefully lifted Rosalind from the car, with the same caution one might use for a fragile porcelain figure. In the private elevator that rose straight to the 58th floor, no one said a word. Duke sat quietly at his master's feet, ears raised in alert attention, yet his amber eyes never left the half-conscious face of the girl. Rosalind slowly began to wake as she felt the softness of cashmere velvet beneath her back. She opened her eyes little by little, and the sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above her, the room vast and open, with transparent glass walls on 3 sides that allowed her to see the whole of Manhattan flickering with lights beneath the snowstorm. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting a warm golden glow that shimmered like 1,000 stars. The floor was laid in polished Italian marble, white streaked with black, extending all the way to a classic stone fireplace in the corner where flames moved in quiet dance. Rosalind jolted upright, her heart pounding hard inside her chest. At once, she pulled the gray wool scarf tighter around her shoulders, her ash-gray eyes darting quickly around the unfamiliar room, every muscle in her body tense like an animal cornered with nowhere to run. That was when she saw him. The man from the Rolls-Royce was seated in a leather armchair across from her, only a few feet away. He had removed his coat, and now wore only a white shirt, with the top button undone, and perfectly tailored black trousers. In the warm light of the fire, she could finally see his face clearly. It was a face so sharply cut it almost seemed severe. A square jaw, a straight Roman nose, and a scar about 4 centimeters long, running from his right temple to his cheekbone, like a permanent reminder of a past that had known little peace. His black hair was combed neatly back, revealing a few threads of silver at his temples, though he didn't look older than 35. In his hand he held a crystal glass of amber whiskey, the ice inside giving a soft clink whenever he turned his wrist. His deep, dark blue eyes were fixed on her with careful attention, utterly expressionless, neither threatening nor kind, only watching. Rosalind swallowed hard, her throat still raw from the fit of coughing earlier. She meant to ask where she was, but the man rose before she could speak. He walked to a small table beside the fireplace, poured a cup of hot tea from a porcelain pot, then came slowly back toward her. Each of his footsteps sounded softly over the marble floor, steady and assured, like a man who had walked this path 1,000 times before. He stopped in front of her, bent slightly, and offered her the cup with a gesture so unexpectedly courteous that it caught her off guard. "Drink this. It will warm you." His voice was so low and quiet that Rosalind almost had to tilt her head to hear it clearly. She hesitated for a few seconds, then slowly reached out with both hands, still stiff with cold, to take the cup. The heat from the porcelain spread through her torn gloves and soothed fingers that had nearly gone numb. As she lowered her head to blow gently across the tea, the old gray scarf wrapped around her neck slipped down just a little, revealing the narrow line of her shoulder beneath the thin sweater. And in that very instant, Raphael went still, his eyes locked on that scarf. The gray wool had faded with the years, its careful hand stitching the kind of work only a mother's hands would have the patience to create. That particular ash-gray shade, that weave, even the way the fringe had been braided into small tassels at the ends, he had seen them somewhere before. No, not seen them. He had touched them with his own hands, hands that had once nearly gone cold and lifeless, on some rainy night in Chicago many years ago, when he had believed he was about to die. Raphael's heart began to pound in his chest with a force that felt almost foreign, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The hand holding the whiskey glass tightened slightly. He cleared his throat with studied calm, trying to keep every muscle in his face under control so that not a trace of feeling would betray him. But when he finally spoke, his voice still came out rougher than usual, carrying a note that even he scarcely recognized anymore. "What is your name?" Rosalind lifted her bewildered ash-gray eyes to the man standing before her. She didn't understand why a stranger so wealthy would want to know the name of a flower girl like her. But there was something in his low, rough voice that made lying impossible. Perhaps she was simply too exhausted to think, or perhaps she sensed that in those deep, dark blue eyes there was not a threat, but something else, something even she couldn't name. She lightly touched her cracked, dry lips with her tongue, and her broken voice slipped out through a throat, still raw with pain. "Rosalind Whitlock." The man said nothing. He only gave the faintest nod, as if confirming something within himself, then quietly turned his back to her. He walked slowly toward the enormous wall of glass that overlooked Manhattan sinking beneath the snowstorm. Rosalind couldn't see his face now, but she could feel a strange change in the air of the room. His broad shoulders beneath the white shirt had gone rigid, his hands adorned with gold rings, tightening into fists, and then slowly releasing again, as though he were trying to master something rising fiercely inside him. One hand drew a sleek black phone from his pocket. He lifted it to his ear and spoke very softly in a language Rosalind didn't understand. Perhaps Italian. His voice was deep and unusually urgent, but even from behind him, Rosalind could still catch her own name spoken twice during that brief exchange. On the other end of the line, Giuseppe Barzini, the old advisor with white silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, who had served the Santoro family for nearly 40 years, was sitting in his study at the mansion on the Upper East Side. He received the call when it was nearly midnight, and he understood that when Raphael called him at such an hour in a tone like this, it was no small matter. Check on her. Rosalind Whitlock. Everything. Right now. Don't miss a single detail. Giuseppe didn't ask a single question. He only answered yes, sir, in Italian, then ended the call. In 40 years of serving this family, he had never once heard Raphael speak with such a trembling note in his voice. Inside the penthouse, Raphael slipped the phone back into his pocket and drew a long breath, steadying himself, reclaiming the calm that usually belonged to him. When he turned back around, his face had returned to its familiar coldness, not a trace of emotion left behind. He walked back to the armchair opposite Rosalind and sat down, one leg crossed over the other, his dark blue eyes fixed intently on her as though waiting. Rosalind held the hot teacup in both hands, the warmth from the porcelain spreading through fingers that were beginning to regain their color. She lowered her head and didn't dare look directly into his eyes. In the heavy silence of the room, she suddenly felt she had to say something to break the suffocating stillness. Perhaps it was because she had been so terribly alone for the past 3 years, or perhaps because some part of her wanted, just once in her life, to be heard by someone. Her voice rose softly, hesitant and fragile, as she began to speak about her only brother. His name was Oliver, and he had just turned 12 that year. He had been born with a congenital heart condition and had spent more of his life in hospitals than in any home since the day he came into the world. His eyes were a clear shade of green, unlike hers, and his smile was so shy, it stirred tenderness in anyone who saw it. Rosalind said that she had promised Oliver when he was still very small that she would never leave him alone, and she had tried to keep that promise through all the cruel years that had followed, no matter how harsh life became. Every word she spoke came out as gently as drifting wind, but to Raphael they felt like cold, sharp blades quietly cutting into his heart, one stroke at a time. He sat motionless, the whiskey in his hand long since gone warm, his dark blue eyes fixed on the pale face of the girl before him without turning away for even a second. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea that the man sitting before her was the one who had never stopped searching for her for the past 9 years, who had never stopped paying detectives in 12 different cities, who had never stopped tearing through every record of every girl named Rosalind Anderson in this country. And now fate had finally brought her to sit before him, small and exhausted, without a single coin to her name, with a little brother waiting for a surgery she had no power to afford. Raphael gently set the whiskey glass down on the marble table, and he decided that tonight he would tell her nothing about those 9 years. Not now. Not when she was still this fragile. Rosalind had drifted into sleep on the cashmere velvet sofa right after finishing the hot tea, her hands still clutching the edge of the gray wool scarf like a child, afraid of losing the only treasure she had left. Raphael rose quietly, gently pulled a goose-down blanket over her shoulders, then signaled for the housemaid to carry her to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Duke refused to leave. The stubborn Belgian shepherd lay down at the foot of the bed where Rosalind slept, its amber eyes lifted toward its master as if to say that tonight it would stand guard over her. Raphael didn't object. He only reached down to stroke Duke's head once, then withdrew to his study on the other wing of the penthouse. The study was the most private place in all of Santoro Tower, a room even Giuseppe was only allowed to enter by invitation. 4 walls paneled in dark walnut, enclosed shelves that stretched to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes on Roman history, philosophy, and family journals yellowed with age. A massive mahogany desk stood at the center. Beneath the warm glow of a single desk lamp, Raphael poured himself another glass of whiskey, took his usual seat in the leather chair, and let his gaze rise toward a glass display case set on the highest shelf. Inside that case, a faded gray wool scarf lay beside a dried white rose. He had preserved them there for 9 years. Raphael took a slow sip of whiskey, the burn spreading down his throat, and the memory of that rainy night in Chicago returned with a clarity so sharp it felt as though it had happened only yesterday. He had been 25 then, 3 years out of Wharton. taking his first steps into learning how to run the empire his father had built. That night, he had gone to Chicago alone to attend an important negotiation with a rival group from the West Coast. His father had warned him to be careful, and Giuseppe had advised him to bring protection. But youth and arrogance had convinced Raphael he could handle everything on his own. The meeting had ended in disaster. When he stepped out of the restaurant close to midnight, an unmarked car had been waiting for him in the parking lot. Raphael had managed to escape into a narrow alley between aging buildings on the south side. But a wound had torn through his right side. The rain that night had been bitterly cold, falling in heavy sheets against rusted metal roofs, creating a steady rhythm like the slow beat of a funeral drum. He had slumped against a damp brick wall, one hand pressed hard against the bleeding wound soaking through his white shirt, the other reaching for a phone to call Giuseppe. But the phone had been lost in his flight, and now he was alone in a dark alley without a single light. Raphael felt the cold creeping into every part of him, his vision beginning to blur, and for the first time in his life, he had thought about death. It was then that a small figure appeared at the far end of the alley. Beneath the weak yellow streetlight behind her, he could make out only the outline of a young girl with long brown hair drenched in rain, a wicker basket in her hand holding the last unsold roses of the night. She had stopped. She had seen him. Raphael had thought she would run or scream. The natural reaction of anyone faced with a man collapsed in a dark alley, his shirt stained red with blood. But she didn't. She stood still for 1 second, then rushed toward him without a word. Her ash-gray eyes were wide with concern, her small hands quickly removing the gray wool scarf from her neck. She folded it into 4, then gently pressed it against the wound at his side to stop the bleeding. He still remembered the warmth of that scarf, the warmth of a stranger's body given to him on the coldest night of his life. Then the girl placed the last white rose from her basket into his freezing hand. She whispered something he was no longer conscious enough to hear, only that her voice trembled, soft as a church bell sounding in the night. Then she ran. Raphael had tried to reach for her, to ask her name, to thank her, but his eyes had closed, and the world slipped into darkness. When he woke in the emergency room of a Chicago hospital, the first thing the nurses told him was that a young girl had called an ambulance, had waited outside until he was taken into surgery, and then disappeared into the rain without leaving a name or a word behind. She had left only 2 things at his side: the gray wool scarf stained with his blood, and the last white rose. Dawn in Manhattan crept slowly up behind the vast glass wall of Santoro Tower, casting a faint wash of pale pink and amber light across the skyscrapers, after a night of relentless snowstorm. Raphael hadn't slept at all. He had remained in his study through the entire night, the glass case resting on the desk before him, the whiskey in his glass long since drained. When the first light of morning touched the eastern window, the sleek black phone on the mahogany desk vibrated softly. A message from Giuseppe. "The report is complete, sir. I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, the study door opened. Giuseppe Barzini stepped in with his usual composed manner, though there was a trace of fatigue on his face after a sleepless night. He was a man of about 62, his silver white hair neatly combed, gold-rimmed glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, always dressed in a dark gray 3-piece suit, no matter the hour. In his hands was a thick brown leather file. Giuseppe didn't offer a morning greeting. He simply placed the file in front of Raphael, then stepped back a few paces with the quiet understanding that his master needed space. Raphael reached out with a hand that trembled slightly and opened the file. The first page held an old scanned image of a birth certificate. Rosalind Anderson, born on March 20th, 1999, in Evanston, Illinois. Mother, Eleanor Whitlock. Father, Marcus Anderson. Raphael drew in a slow breath. That surname, Anderson, was the name he had searched for relentlessly over the past 9 years without ever fully knowing it. He turned to the next page. Giuseppe's report was detailed down to each year. When Rosalind was 12, her mother, Eleanor, had passed away after a long battle with cancer. When she was 15, her father remarried a woman named Diana, and her half-brother Oliver Anderson was born that same year. When Rosalind was 17, Diana left the family, abandoning the 2-year-old boy she had never truly loved. And then, in the winter, when Rosalind turned 18, her father died in a car accident just outside Chicago, driving home after a night of drinking. Raphael closed his eyes briefly, then turned the page again. This was the part he had waited for all these 9 years. Immediately after her father's funeral, Rosalind went to the local administrative office and filed to change her surname from Anderson to Whitlock, taking the name of her late mother. The reason she wrote was simple. She wanted to carry the name of the only person who had ever truly loved her. But there was another reason she didn't write down: to escape her uncle Harold Anderson, her father's younger brother, a greedy man who had seized the house and the small inheritance left for Rosalind and her brother immediately after the funeral. She had lifted her 3-year-old brother into her arms, gathered a few clothes and the most important things she owned, and left Evanston without ever looking back. From the age of 18 until now, she had lived under the name Whitlock in Chicago for 6 years, and for the past 3 years, she had moved to Manhattan because Mount Sinai Hospital had a stronger cardiology team to care for Oliver. Raphael went still as he read. For 9 years, he had paid private investigators in 12 different cities to search for a girl named Rosalind Anderson with chestnut hair and ash-gray eyes. But that girl had ceased to exist on paper the moment she turned 18. He had passed by her countless times without ever knowing, perhaps even here in Manhattan itself over the past 3 years. The final page of the file held a photograph captured from a security camera at Mount Sinai Hospital. A young woman with brown hair sitting on a bench in the corridor, her face buried in her hands as she wept. It was the very face he had carried in his memory for 9 years. Raphael lifted his hand and touched the image, his fingertips trembling faintly. Giuseppe stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching his master. He had known Raphael since the boy was 10, and in more than 20 years, he had never seen so much emotion cross that face. Giuseppe cleared his throat softly. "Sir, there is one more thing. The boy, Oliver, is in the pediatric ward at Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Thompson says he needs surgery within 2 weeks, or his life will be at risk." Raphael rose slowly, closing the file. He picked up the glass case containing the blood-stained gray scarf and the dried white rose, then walked toward the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. Dawnlight filtered through the windows, casting faint streaks across his face. He stopped before the half-closed wooden door. Inside, Rosalind lay sleeping with Duke guarding at the foot of the bed. He lifted his hand and pressed it lightly against the warm wood, drew in a slow breath, and whispered the words he had carried within him for 9 long years. "It's you. I've finally found you." Rosalind opened her eyes beneath the gentle morning sunlight filtering through the cream-colored cashmere curtains. In the first moment after waking, she didn't know where she was. The bed linen beneath her felt softer than anything she had ever touched in her life, and the air in the room carried such a light breath of lavender that she thought she must still be dreaming. Only when Duke lifted his head slightly from the foot of the bed, and his amber eyes met hers with that same familiar gentleness, did she remember everything that had happened the night before. The man in the Rolls-Royce, the luxurious penthouse high above the city, the cup of hot tea, and the unusually rough voice with which he had asked her name. Rosalind quickly sat up, only to discover that someone had changed her into a set of pure white silk sleepwear. Probably the housemaid, she thought to herself, because there had been no sense of violation in the way they had cared for her. On the chair beside the bed lay a neatly folded set of new clothes, a beige cashmere sweater and a pair of warm brown trousers, along with a pair of soft leather boots, still bearing the tag of an Italian brand she had only ever seen in magazines. She dressed in them with quiet embarrassment, then followed Duke down the wide marble hallway. The smell of coffee and freshly toasted bread led her to the dining room. There, Raphael was seated at the head of a long mahogany table. An open copy of the Wall Street Journal spread before him, a cup of dark espresso set near his hand. When Rosalind entered, he folded the newspaper closed with calm precision and lifted his dark blue eyes to her with a composure so complete it was impossible to read. "Please, sit down." Rosalind hesitated, then took the chair across from him, her hands resting anxiously in her lap. The chef, dressed in a white uniform, silently placed before her a plate of fried eggs, buttered toast, and a cup of hot coffee with milk. She hadn't eaten a proper breakfast like this in years, yet she only lifted her fork with shy hesitation, not daring to eat much. Raphael watched her in silence for a moment, then spoke slowly. "I know about your brother, Oliver. I know about the surgery he needs within the next 2 weeks at Mount Sinai Hospital. I know the cost is $180,000, and I know you can't pay for it." Rosalind startled so badly that she dropped her fork onto the plate, the sound of metal striking porcelain ringing out dry and sharp. Her ash-gray eyes widened as she stared at him, full of alarm and caution. "How do you know that?" Raphael didn't answer her question. He simply slid a cream-colored folder that had already been prepared across the table toward her. "I have a proposal for you." I will cover the full cost of Oliver's surgery, as well as all of his treatment and post-operative care for 1 year. In return, you will work for me for 12 months as the person in charge of floral design and decoration for my entire La Rosa Nera restaurant group across New York. I own 5 restaurants in that group, and I want each one to have its own distinct floral identity, renewed every week. Rosalind stared at the folder in front of her, her heart beating wildly inside her chest. She lifted doubtful eyes to his face. Why me? I'm only a flower girl selling on the street. I don't have any degree in design, and I've never worked in a fine restaurant. You could hire anyone with 10 times more experience than I have. Raphael took a sip of espresso, his gaze never leaving her face. I saw the way you held those roses in your basket last night. People don't learn that kind of instinct in school. You have something professional designers don't have: honesty. And to me, that matters most. Think of this as a business investment on my part. Rosalind fell silent for a long while. Her lashes lowered as she looked at the folder. $180,000. Oliver would be saved. He would have surgery by the best doctors. She would no longer have to stand beneath falling snow and sell flowers on the street. This was the very thing she had prayed for through countless long nights. And yet now that it stood before her, she felt afraid. Because life had taught her one thing: anything too beautiful to be true usually wasn't true at all. She raised her head and looked directly into Raphael's dark blue eyes. Her voice came out soft, but steady. I agree, but I have one condition. I want a formal written contract, with signatures from lawyers representing both sides, clearly stating the terms of the job. I don't want anyone, including you, to mistake this for me selling myself in exchange for money. I may be poor, but I still have my dignity. A silence passed between them. Then Raphael's mouth curved slightly. It was the first time in years that the corner of his mouth had lifted into a real smile, so faint it was almost invisible, yet enough to melt an entire long winter inside his heart. I agree to your condition, Miss Whitlock. My lawyer will be here this afternoon. The contract was signed early that afternoon in Raphael's private office on the 57th floor of Santoro Tower, witnessed by 2 lawyers representing both sides. Rosalind's attorney was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Hennessy, whose services Raphael had personally paid for to ensure that Rosalind truly had someone protecting her interests. When Rosalind placed her pen to the paper and signed her name, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that her life was turning to a new page she had never dared to imagine. The moment the ink had dried, Raphael made a brief phone call, and only 2 hours later, Oliver was transferred from the general pediatric ward of Mount Sinai Hospital to a private intensive care suite reserved for VIP patients on the top floor. The black Rolls-Royce took Rosalind directly to the hospital, Raphael sitting beside her in silence the entire way, Duke lying quietly at their feet. When the hospital room door opened, Rosalind froze at the threshold. The room no longer resembled the one she had visited for the past 2 years. Instead, it was a warm, spacious place, with light wood-paneled walls, a large window overlooking Central Park, blanketed in white snow, a velvet armchair for family, and fresh yellow tulips arranged beside the bed. But what brought tears to Rosalind's eyes wasn't the luxury of the room. It was her younger brother lying in the center of it. Oliver had grown much weaker since the last time she saw him. His small face was thin, his skin pale, his brown hair the same shade as hers falling across his forehead. Yet when he opened his clear green eyes and saw Rosalind standing at the doorway, those eyes lit up like a beacon in the dark, and his lips formed that same, shy, familiar smile. Sister. Rosalind couldn't hold herself together any longer. She rushed to the bed, dropped to her knees, and pulled her little brother tightly into her arms. He was so small, so fragile, that she feared she might break him, yet she held him tighter and tighter, as though letting go for even a moment would make him disappear. For the first time in so many years, Rosalind allowed herself to cry. Tears she had held back since the day their mother died, since the day their father was gone, from the freezing nights spent sleeping on laundromat benches, from the mornings she stood outside the hospital unable to pay for treatment. All of it broke free now against Oliver's small shoulder. The boy didn't ask why she was crying, didn't ask why the room was so beautiful, didn't ask why strangers in white coats stood nearby with gentle smiles. He simply lifted his thin little hand and patted his sister's back the way she had once comforted him when he was very small. Dr. Thompson stood by the bed, his tortoiseshell glasses slipping down his nose, quietly explaining that Oliver's surgery would take place on Monday morning the following week, performed by him and a team of 4 leading cardiologists brought in from Massachusetts General Hospital. Every cost, from hospital fees to medication to 1 year of post-operative care, had already been fully covered by an anonymous benefactor. He didn't speak the benefactor's name, as that had been their request. Rosalind turned toward the doorway where Raphael stood. He hadn't entered. He remained just outside the glass, both hands in his pockets, his shoulder resting lightly against the corridor wall. On his usually cold face was an expression she had never seen before, something distant, something gentle enough to make her heart ache. When their eyes met through the glass, Raphael gave the faintest nod, then turned and walked away down the corridor. His steps were slow, measured, echoing softly across the hospital marble floor. He didn't let Rosalind see that in the moment she held her brother and wept, his iron heart had quietly begun to melt. When Raphael had walked about 20 meters, on the opposite side of the VIP corridor, another man stepped out of the elevator. It was Victor Delacroix, head of the Delacroix family, one of the Santoro family's oldest rivals. He was 38, tall and lean, his pale blonde hair swept back, a thin scar cutting across the corner of his upper lip. Victor had come to visit a cousin undergoing cancer treatment on a lower floor, but his gaze lifted by chance toward the far end of the corridor. His ice-blue eyes narrowed as he recognized Raphael Santoro, and then his gaze settled on the figure of a young woman holding a child inside a distant hospital room, a woman to whom Raphael had just given a look. Victor had never seen him give anyone before. Victor's lips curved slightly. A weakness. For the first time in many years, Raphael Santoro had a weakness. Oliver's surgery took place on Monday morning as scheduled, lasting 7 hours under the hands of Dr. Thompson and a team of the finest physicians. Rosalind sat outside the operating room the entire time, her fingers tightly interlaced, her lips whispering prayers she had learned as a child. When the doors finally opened and Dr. Thompson stepped out with a faint smile on his exhausted face, Rosalind collapsed into the chair in a wave of relief so deep it left her weak. The surgery had been a success. Oliver would live. 2 weeks later, when the snow in Manhattan had begun to melt into thin streams running along the sidewalks, Rosalind officially began her first day of work at La Rosa Nera on 5th Avenue. The restaurant was housed in a classic building from the early 20th century, its exterior clad in cream-colored sandstone with arched windows rising nearly 3 meters high. Inside was a warm, intimate space with dark walnut tables, deep wine, red velvet chairs, and small crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow over each table. On her first day, Rosalind arrived very early, before the sun had fully risen. She carried a basket filled with white lilies, purple dahlias, and fresh green olive branches that she had personally selected at the wholesale flower market in Chelsea at 4 o'clock in the morning. The restaurant manager, an Italian man named Antonio with a neatly trimmed mustache and a courteous manner, welcomed her with a respect she hadn't received in many years. He showed her around the entire restaurant and introduced her to the staff as the official floral designer, not as someone working out of obligation or charity. Rosalind began her work slowly and carefully. She moved from table to table, sitting for a moment at each one to feel the light, the flow of air from the ventilation, and the surrounding space. Only then did she begin to arrange the flowers. Under her hands, the arrangements weren't rigid or formulaic like those of trained professionals. Each one carried its own quiet story, as if every flower were whispering something to the person seated beside it. On the third morning, as Rosalind sat trimming away excess leaves from a large arrangement in the center of the room, she heard the restaurant door chime. She didn't look up, assuming it was a delivery, as the restaurant wouldn't open for another 3 hours. But when a familiar pair of black leather shoes stopped just a few steps away, her heart began to race before she even lifted her gaze. Raphael stood there in a perfectly tailored black suit, the top button of his white shirt undone, his hands clasped behind his back. "I just stopped by to see how things are progressing." He said it in the most neutral, detached tone possible, but his eyes betrayed him. Those dark blue eyes lingered on her hands as she worked far longer than an ordinary glance would allow. From that day on, Raphael began appearing at La Rosa Nera every morning, always at the same time when Rosalind was arranging flowers, always with the same line about stopping by to check on the work. Their conversations at first were brief and centered almost entirely around flowers. Rosalind told him about the meaning of white lilies in weddings back in rural Chicago, about why she liked pairing dahlias with olive branches. Raphael listened, truly listened, his gaze never leaving her face when she spoke. Occasionally, he asked thoughtful questions about her life, and she began to feel something strange, that this powerful man cared about her in a way she couldn't quite understand. There were moments when she would suddenly look up and catch his eyes resting on her face. And in that gaze, there was no unfamiliar curiosity of a man looking at a woman he had just met, but the quiet familiarity of someone who had known her for a very long time. Giuseppe observed all of this in silence. One afternoon, as Raphael had just left La Rosa Nera and was walking toward the Rolls-Royce waiting outside, Giuseppe walked beside him, his hands folded behind his back in the manner of a gentleman. "Sir, I have known you since you were 10 years old. You have waited for her for 9 long years, day after day, night after night, never stopping your search. Now she is here, only a few steps away from you. Please remember that the greatest fear of a man is not losing what he has never had, but losing what he has spent a lifetime waiting for. Don't let yourself destroy it." Raphael paused beside the car door, lifted his eyes toward the pale blue Manhattan sky just freed from the storm. He didn't answer, but in those deep, dark blue eyes, something had softened. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, Rosalind quietly placed the final olive branches into the arrangement, her ash-gray eyes narrowing slightly in thought. 2 weeks had passed since the day she met him, and yet deep within her there remained a strange, unnameable feeling, as though this man wasn't meeting her for the first time, as though he had been looking at her with those eyes for a very long time, from a moment she could no longer remember. It was a night at the end of January, the Manhattan air so cold that each breath turned instantly into pale white mist the moment it left the lips. Rosalind left La Rosa Nera when the clock was nearing 11 o'clock at night. She had stayed later than usual to finish special floral arrangements for a VIP event the next day. The restaurant was almost entirely dark now. Only Antonio remained at the front locking the doors, and an elderly security guard was making his final round on the ground floor. Rosalind pulled her gray wool coat tighter around her shoulders, wrapped her mother's gray scarf snugly at her neck, and made her way down to the underground parking level to retrieve the small car Raphael had arranged for her. Duke walked beside her, his steps silent against the cold concrete. At Raphael's insistence, the Belgian shepherd always accompanied her during late shifts, and she had grown so accustomed to that steady presence that Duke now felt like an inseparable part of her new life. The parking level was deserted at that hour. Dim fluorescent lights flickered above rows of cars dusted with a thin layer of grime, and the only sound was the echo of Rosalind's footsteps carrying through the hollow space. She had walked only a few dozen meters toward her car when Duke suddenly stopped. His ears snapped upright, the fur along his spine bristled, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Rosalind froze, her heart pounding violently. Before she could understand what was happening, 4 tall men in black coats stepped out from the shadows between 2 parked cars ahead, cutting off her path, and then, from behind a concrete pillar, a 5th figure emerged slowly. He was tall and lean, with pale blonde hair swept back, icy blue eyes, and a thin scar crossing the corner of his upper lip. He smiled at Rosalind, a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Good evening, Miss Whitlock. It's a pleasure to meet you." Rosalind stepped back instinctively, her hands tightening around the strap of the leather bag on her shoulder. She didn't know who he was, but she understood immediately that this wasn't a chance encounter. Duke lowered his body slightly, his amber eyes locked onto the blonde man, the growl now unmistakably a warning. Victor Delacroix took another step forward, his hands still in his coat pockets, and in that instant, Duke exploded into motion. The Belgian shepherd launched forward like an arrow released from a bow, and within seconds he had intercepted the 2 men in front, forcing them backward in panic. The other 2 moved toward Rosalind, but Duke pivoted sharply, his white fangs flashing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, halting them in place. Yet while Duke was occupied holding the 4 men at bay, Victor drew something from inside his coat, a small black weapon, and slowly raised it toward Rosalind. She went rigid, her ash-gray eyes wide, unable to move even a finger. But before Victor could act, the piercing screech of tires tore through the far end of the parking level. A black Rolls-Royce surged in at impossible speed, stopping just meters away as its doors flew open. Raphael stepped out, followed by Marco and 2 additional guards. Rosalind had seen many expressions on Raphael's face over the past 2 weeks, his cold composure, his calm restraint, even moments of quiet gentleness when he looked at her. But what she saw now was something she had never witnessed. In those deep, dark blue eyes, there was no warmth left at all, only the gaze of a predator that had found its prey. He moved toward Victor with long, steady strides, his face utterly still. Giuseppe, stepping out just behind him, understood at once what was about to happen. He quickly moved in front of Raphael and placed a hand against his chest. "Sir, don't. Not here. Not in front of her." Raphael stopped. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles stood out in sharp lines. But he stopped. Victor gave a cold smile, slipped the weapon back into his coat, and dipped his head in a mocking gesture toward Raphael. He signaled his men to withdraw, and within seconds, all 5 of them vanished into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. Raphael turned back toward Rosalind, and his expression changed instantly. The predator's gaze dissolved, replaced by a deep, unguarded concern he could no longer hide. He stepped toward her, his gloved hand lifting to steady her trembling shoulder. On the drive back to Santoro Tower in the Rolls-Royce, Rosalind curled into the corner of her seat, her hands still shaking uncontrollably. Duke lay at her feet, his head resting on her shoe as if offering quiet reassurance. She lifted her eyes to Raphael sitting across from her, and her voice came out soft, trembling. "Who are you really?" Raphael remained silent for a long time. He stared out the window at the passing Manhattan streets, his dark blue eyes shadowed like a moonless night. Then he answered, his voice low and rough. "I'm someone you shouldn't know, Rosalind, but I swear to you, with everything I have, I will never let you be hurt. Never." That night, Rosalind couldn't sleep at all. She had returned to the small, warm apartment Raphael had arranged for her and Oliver near the Upper East Side, had bathed and changed into soft nightclothes, had checked on Oliver sleeping peacefully in the next room, with steady breathing. And yet when she lay down on the comfortable bed and closed her eyes, her mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of Raphael in the underground parking, the cold, predatory look in his eyes, the cryptic words he had spoken in the car. "I'm someone you shouldn't know." Those words echoed again and again through the long night, and each time they returned, her heart tightened in a way she couldn't explain. Early the next morning, when the first light of day slipped through the window, Rosalind made a decision. She put on her gray wool coat, wrapped her mother's worn scarf around her neck, and quietly left the apartment while Oliver was still asleep. She walked through the silent streets of early morning Manhattan, her steps carrying her without conscious thought to a place she had never been before, yet somehow knew she needed to find. St. Patrick's Cathedral rose before her in the heart of the city, its Gothic towers reaching into the gray sky. The old wooden doors stood open for the faithful, arriving for morning prayer. Inside, the silence was so deep that Rosalind could hear the beating of her own heart. Light streamed through the great stained glass windows above, casting shifting patterns of blue, red, and violet across the marble floor. She moved quietly to an empty pew near the front, knelt down, and lowered her head, closing her eyes. She didn't know what she wanted to pray for, only that she was searching for some small piece of peace, for an answer to the questions that were slowly consuming her. She knelt there for a long time, long enough to feel the faint numbness in her knees. When she finally lifted her head, she realized that an elderly priest was standing quietly across from her, his gentle eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite understand. How long had he been there? How long had he been watching her? The priest offered a soft smile and slowly approached. He appeared to be around 65, with graying hair, a kind face, and warm brown eyes that carried the calm of a man who had devoted his life to faith. "May I sit beside you, my child?" Rosalind gave a small nod. He sat down beside her, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "My name is Father Matthew. I've served this church for nearly 30 years. May I ask you something? Not to intrude, but to ease my own conscience. Are you Rosalind Whitlock?" Rosalind looked at him, her ash-gray eyes widening in surprise. "How do you know my name?" Father Matthew let out a quiet breath, his gaze lifting briefly toward the statue of Christ above, as though asking for permission. Then he looked back at her, his voice gentle but clear. "Do you know that you once saved a man's life, my child?" Rosalind froze, her heart suddenly pounding. "I don't understand what you mean. Many years ago, on a rainy night in Chicago, you passed through a dark alley. There was a man there, barely alive. You stopped. You didn't walk away. You took the gray wool scarf from your neck and placed a white rose in his hand. Then you ran to call for help, waited until he was taken safely into the hospital, and disappeared without leaving a name." Rosalind felt as if the world had come to a halt around her. She hadn't thought about that night in years, She had only been 18 then, wandering the streets of Chicago after her father's death, surviving by selling the last of her flowers to buy milk for Oliver. She had acted on instinct, without thought of consequence or recognition. She had almost forgotten it had ever happened. "You still remember that?" she whispered. Father Matthew nodded gently, his eyes glistening. "That man hasn't only remembered you for 9 years. He has searched for you every day, every hour, every moment. He has hired private investigators across 12 cities, spent a fortune trying to find the girl who saved his life that night in the rain. But he never succeeded, until New Year's Eve." Rosalind felt her hands begin to tremble. "Who is he?" she asked softly. Father Matthew drew in a deep breath, then met her gaze directly. "His name is Rafael Santoro, and his father, the late Don Alessandro Santoro, was once a friend of mine in our university days before we chose very different paths. Rafael is the head of the Santoro family, my child, one of the 5 most powerful Mafia families in New York. A man whose name this entire city fears." Rosalind felt the blood in her body turn to ice. Her trembling hand rose to clutch the gray scarf at her neck, her ash-gray eyes fixed on the priest before her. The world around her fell into a terrifying silence, and within that silence, she heard the sound of her own heart breaking. Slowly, piece by piece, Rosalind stepped out of St. Patrick's Cathedral without truly feeling the ground beneath her feet. Snow had begun to fall again over Manhattan, delicate flakes spiraling through the air before settling on her brown hair, on her coat, on the gray wool scarf wrapped around her neck. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel anything at all except the storm raging inside her chest. She walked along the sidewalk, then broke into a run. Her boots struck against slush and melting snow, her coat flying open behind her in the wind. She didn't know where she was going until she lifted her head and saw Santoro Tower rising before her, its dark glass reflecting the dull gray sky of the afternoon. The doorman recognized her from the past 2 weeks and opened the doors immediately without a word. Rosalind rushed into the private elevator that led to the 58th floor, her trembling hands pressing the wrong button twice before she steadied herself. When the doors opened, she stepped into the familiar penthouse without hesitation. She knew Raphael had a private study at the end of the west corridor, a room she had seen him enter and leave many times but had never dared to ask about. Now she knew. She walked straight to the dark walnut door and pushed it open gently. It wasn't locked. Raphael stood with his back to her, facing the vast glass wall overlooking the snowfall across Manhattan. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand holding a half-empty glass of whiskey. He must have heard her footsteps, but he didn't turn. Rosalind stood in the doorway for a long moment, like fear ash-gray eyes sweeping across the room. Then her gaze stopped at the large mahogany desk in the center. Beneath the warm yellow glow of the desk lamp sat a glass case. Inside it were only 2 objects: a faded gray wool scarf, woven in the exact same pattern as the scarf around her neck-in, identical twin to the one she thought she had lost forever that night in Chicago, and beside it, a dried white rose, its petals fragile as rice paper, resting in a small ceramic holder. Rosalind felt her legs weaken beneath her. She walked slowly into the room, step by step, until she stood before the desk. Her trembling hand rose and pressed gently against the cold glass. Tears slipped down her cheeks in silent drops, one after another, without her even realizing. "Is it you?" she whispered, her voice breaking like glass shattering on stone. "Is it you, Raphael?" At the window, Raphael slowly turned. His dark blue eyes found her ash-gray ones, and stayed there. In that moment, every layer of cold restraint he had built around himself over a lifetime collapsed. The face of a powerful Mafia leader, a man feared across New York, vanished completely. Before Rosalind now stood only a man who had waited 9 long years and was finally face to face with the one he had searched for across an entire decade. He set the whiskey glass down on the desk, his hand trembling slightly as he did. He took one step toward her, then another, and stopped an arm's length away. He didn't touch her. He simply stood there, looking at her with a gaze Rosalind had never seen in any man before. "It's me." His voice came out rough, as though the words had been trapped in his throat for 9 years and were only now finding release. "It's me, Rosalind. The man in that alley, the one who thought his life would end in Chicago on that rainy night, the one who woke in a hospital with only your scarf beside him, not even knowing your name, not knowing where you were, not knowing if he would ever see you again. I searched for you. Do you know that? I searched for you every day, every hour, every moment for 9 years. I thought you weren't real, that you were just a dream my mind created to give me a reason to keep living. I almost gave up so many times. Rosalind lifted her hand to her mouth, tears now flowing freely down her face. She couldn't speak. She could only stand there, looking at the man before her, at the dark blue eyes now reddened, at his hands clenching and releasing as though he were holding himself back. He didn't step forward to embrace her. He kept that distance, that single arm's length, as though he feared that if he touched her even once, his 9-year dream would dissolve into nothing. And then Rosalind did something she hadn't expected even of herself. She took one step forward, then another, and fell into his chest as though it were the only place in the world that could hold her. Raphael's arms finally came around her, tight enough that she could feel the tremor within them. And in that quiet study, beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp, beside the glass case that had held 9 years of waiting, two souls who had crossed a distance far too long finally stood in each other's arms, needing no more words at all. That night, Raphael and Rosalind sat beside the great fireplace in the main living room of the penthouse, where the flames moved quietly over oak logs and cast a warm golden-orange light across the room. Beyond the windows, snow was still falling without end over Manhattan, whitening the world beyond the glass. But inside that room, there was only warmth, only stillness, and only two people who had lived through too much pain now sitting beside one another on the thick fur rug before the fire. Raphael had taken off his black suit jacket, leaving only the white shirt with the top buttons loosened at his throat. Rosalind sat beside him, her legs folded beneath her, a cup of hot milk tea in her hands that the chef had brought up earlier. Duke lay curled at their feet, his amber eyes closed in peaceful sleep. Rosalind spoke first. She had carried her story within her for so many years, never telling it to anyone, and now she wanted to tell it to the man beside her. She spoke of her childhood in Evanston, of the small wooden house with the rose garden her mother had planted with her own hands. She spoke of her gentle mother, whose hands always smelled of baked bread, the woman who had taught her to knit and who had made a pair of identical gray scarves, one of which was now wrapped around her neck. She told him about the year she was 12, when her mother died after a long battle with cancer, and about the emptiness she had felt holding the scarf her mother had finished stitch by stitch from a hospital bed. Then she spoke of her father. Her voice trembled slightly when she reached that part. He had once been a good man, she said, but after her mother died, he turned to alcohol as a way to forget his grief. And little by little, the bottles transformed him into someone she no longer recognized. Life in that house had not been peaceful for her from the age of 12 until she turned 18. Her father remarried. Then her stepmother abandoned the family when Oliver was only 2 years old. And at last, on a winter night in Chicago, her father was killed in a car accident after driving away from a bar. She had left home on the very night of his funeral, carrying her 2-year-old brother in her arms, bringing nothing with her except one small suitcase and her mother's gray scarf. But what she remembered most clearly about that funeral was not sorrow, but guilt. "I couldn't cry, Raphael," she whispered, her ash-gray eyes fixed on the fire. "I stood there through the whole funeral looking at my father's coffin, and not one tear came. I felt like a heartless daughter. It took me years to understand that sometimes a human heart can stay frozen for so long that it forgets how to weep." Raphael laid his hand gently over hers as it trembled, saying nothing. He only kept that warm hand there, a quiet promise that he was here, that he was listening, that she no longer had to carry those memories alone. Then it was Raphael's turn. He told her about the pressure of inheriting the family from the time he was 21, when his father fell suddenly ill. He told her about that fateful night in Chicago, not what had happened in the alley because she already knew, but why he had been there. "My father wanted to lead the Santoro family into the business of trafficking forbidden things," he said quietly. "Things our family had never touched in 3 generations, and I knew that once we crossed into that world, there would be no turning back. I flew to Chicago that night to meet with old associates, to try to convince them not to sign with my father, so I could keep the family from taking that path. The meeting failed. Our rivals were displeased with me, and they decided to solve the matter in their own way. My mother, Isabella, had already withdrawn to our ancestral estate in Tuscany to live in quiet seclusion following my father's death, leaving me to navigate those dark waters on my own. You saved my life that night, Rosalind. But you didn't only save my life. I woke in that hospital holding your scarf, and for the first time in many years, I realized that true goodness still existed in this world. You saved my soul. Do you know that? I kept that white rose with me through every important meeting for 9 years, as a reminder that I had to become a man you could be proud of having saved. Rosalind looked at him, her ash-gray eyes bright with tears in the firelight. She said nothing. She only lifted her free hand and touched his face, her fingertips brushing softly over the long scar that ran from his temple to his cheek. Raphael closed his eyes beneath that gentle touch, and then when he opened them again, he leaned down slowly, giving her all the time she needed to pull away if she wished. But she didn't pull away. His lips touched hers, soft and light, their first kiss as delicate as a rose petal falling onto still water, carrying with it all the years of waiting, and all the wounds that had finally begun to heal in the warm glow of a snow-filled Manhattan night. In the weeks following that night by the fire, Rosalind's life seemed to turn into something entirely new. Oliver was discharged from Mount Sinai Hospital after 3 weeks of recovery, and now he was living with his sister in the warm 2-bedroom apartment Raphael had arranged for them near the Upper East Side. The apartment wasn't as grand as Raphael's penthouse, but it held a warmth Rosalind had never dared to dream of. A small living room with a fireplace, a bright kitchen with a window overlooking the park, a cozy bedroom for Oliver designed like every child's dream, with shelves filled with comic books and a small walnut piano that Rosalind never asked how Raphael had found. Oliver had fallen in love with the piano at first sight, and during his recovery, he spent nearly all his time learning simple melodies from online videos. That Saturday afternoon, Manhattan's sky was unusually clear. The late January snowstorms had passed, leaving behind a pale February sun and a sharp, biting wind. Rosalind stood at the apartment door, wearing the cream-colored wool coat Raphael had given her the week before. She was about to go to a flower shop in Chelsea called Petals and Thorns to pick up a special order for a birthday event at La Rosa Nera that evening. "I'll be back in an hour, Oliver. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know. If anything happens, call me right away." The boy laughed softly, hugging Duke, who lay beside the piano. "Don't worry, I've got Duke. No one will come near me." Duke lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes fixed on Rosalind with unwavering loyalty, as if promising to protect the boy with his life. Rosalind kissed her brother's forehead, stroked Duke's head once, then stepped out of the apartment. The trip to the flower shop went smoothly. It took her about 40 minutes to choose purple tulips, yellow primroses, and a few branches of dried barley to arrange. By the time she stepped out of the shop with a basket full of flowers, the afternoon had begun to fade, long shadows stretching across the old stone streets of Chelsea. She turned into a narrow alley as a shortcut toward the nearest subway station. That was where 3 black sport utility vehicles suddenly appeared from both ends of the alley, cutting off her escape. Rosalind barely had time to react before 4 large men stepped out from the vehicles. She recognized them instantly. They were the same men she had seen in the underground parking that night. She tried to turn and run, but a strong hand seized her arm, and a man's voice spoke close to her ear, polite but cold. "Please don't make this difficult, Miss Whitlock. We won't hurt you." The basket slipped from her hands, purple tulips and yellow primroses scattering across the stone pavement. Rosalind was pushed into the middle vehicle. The door slammed shut, and within less than a minute, the convoy was gone, leaving behind only the abandoned woven basket among crushed flowers. 15 blocks away, in an office on the 57th floor of Santoro Tower, Raphael was in a meeting with Giuseppe and 2 lawyers discussing the acquisition of land in Queens. He lifted his glass of whiskey for a sip when the sleek black phone on the desk vibrated softly. A voice message from an unknown number. Raphael frowned, opened it, and pressed play. Victor Delacroix's familiar voice filled the silent office, low and laced with satisfaction. "Hello, Raphael. My old friend. I think it's time we had a serious conversation. Rosalind Whitlock is with me. Don't worry, she isn't hurt, and I don't intend to harm her, as long as you cooperate. I want full control of the Brooklyn port and all related contracts. You have exactly 24 hours to give it up. Otherwise, she will never return to you. The clock has already started. I wish you a thoughtful evening." The message ended. In the silence that followed, no one dared breathe too loudly. Giuseppe and the lawyers turned to look at Raphael. His face showed no expression at all. His dark blue eyes had darkened like a moonless night. The hand holding the crystal whiskey glass tightened, tighter and tighter still, until the glass shattered in his grip into dozens of glittering shards. Giuseppe leapt to his feet, quickly pulling out a handkerchief. "Sir, your hand." But Raphael felt nothing. He didn't even notice the blood dripping from his palm onto the mahogany desk. In that moment, he was no longer the cold, calculating man feared across New York. He was only a man who had just found the one person he loved after 9 years of waiting. And now someone had dared to lay a hand on her. For the first time in his 34 years of life, Raphael Santoro understood what true fear felt like. Giuseppe quickly bandaged Raphael's hand, his aged fingers moving with the calm precision of a surgeon, while the 2 lawyers had already been dismissed from the room. When the final layer of white bandage was secured, he sat down across from Raphael and looked directly into the darkness of his eyes. "Sir, listen to me. You are the head of the Santoro family, the son of Don Alessandro, the heir to 3 generations that have never bowed to anyone. We do not yield, and we never will. We will bring her back, and we will end this. But you must remain calm. If you let anger take control now, Victor wins, because a man who loses his reason has already lost the battle before stepping onto the field." Raphael drew in a deep breath and closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them again, the cold, predatory focus had returned, but now it was controlled, sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. He picked up his phone and made a single call. "Marco, call everyone back, the entire team. 30 minutes. And bring Duke. I need him." 30 minutes later, a convoy of 3 black sport utility vehicles assembled in the underground level of Santoro Tower. 12 men in black suits stood in formation, ready to receive orders. Duke had been brought from Rosalind's apartment, standing beside Raphael with his ears alert, as though he sensed something was wrong with the woman he had come to protect. Raphael held the woven basket Marco had retrieved from the alley in Chelsea, where Rosalind had been taken. Inside, a few crushed purple tulip petals remained, along with a small handkerchief Rosalind used while arranging flowers. He crouched and held the handkerchief out to Duke. "Find her." The Belgian shepherd sniffed carefully, then his amber eyes sharpened with certainty. He began to move, slow at first, then faster as he caught the scent. The convoy followed Duke through the streets of Manhattan, then across the Brooklyn Bridge toward the old industrial district. As they approached the Red Hook waterfront in Brooklyn, Duke led them to a row of abandoned warehouses by the river, old brick buildings from the early 20th century standing silent in the fading light. Duke stopped before one warehouse with shattered windows, lowered himself, and gave a low growl. Raphael nodded to Marco. "Go in." The raid unfolded with such speed and precision that the guards inside didn't even have time to raise an alarm before they were subdued. In less than 4 minutes, the entire warehouse was under Raphael's control. He pushed open the door to the innermost room, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Rosalind sat on a simple wooden chair inside the small enclosed space. She wasn't tied, only the door had been locked from the outside. When it opened, and she saw Raphael standing there with Duke beside him, her ash-gray eyes filled instantly with tears. She sprang to her feet and ran into his arms without a word. Raphael held her tightly, his bandaged hand trembling as it touched her brown hair. He had come. He had truly come. "Are you all right?" But that moment lasted only a few seconds, because Marco entered with Victor Delacroix restrained behind him, his hands forced back. Victor showed no fear. He only smiled with quiet mockery as he looked at Raphael. "You're faster than I expected, Santoro. But you know this doesn't change anything." Raphael gently moved Rosalind behind him, shielding her, then stepped forward, his hand clenched again, the knuckles pale beneath the bandage. He could end everything here, right now. No one in that room would dare speak. No one in Manhattan would ever know. Victor Delacroix could disappear from the world forever, and no one would ever threaten the woman behind him again. In that moment, Raphael stood on the edge of the same path every man in the Santoro family had walked for 3 generations. But then he felt a small, warm hand rest lightly against his back. He turned. Rosalind stood behind him, her ash-gray eyes fixed on him, not with fear, but with trust. A trust he wasn't sure he deserved. And in that look, Raphael understood. He drew in a slow breath, and his clenched hand slowly relaxed. He turned back to Victor. "No, I won't let her love a man like that," he signaled to Marco. "Call Agent Donovan at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a gift for him, and bring everything from my safe. Every piece of evidence I've gathered on the Delacroix family over the past 7 years. Enough to make sure our friend here never walks free again." For the first time, Victor Delacroix's expression faltered, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night in Red Hook. Victor Delacroix had been taken away that very night by Agent Donovan and his team, along with the thick files containing evidence of dozens of crimes that major newspapers across New York ran the story on their front pages for an entire week, though not a single line mentioned the name Santoro or Raphael. That was his way. It had always been his way, remaining in the shadows while justice was carried out under another name. But in those 3 weeks, something within Raphael had changed. He had spent many long nights alone in his study, staring at the glass case on the shelf, thinking about the man he had become. He thought about Rosalind, about Oliver, about the way her ash-gray eyes had looked at him in that room in Red Hook, with a trust he wasn't sure he deserved. And at last, on a March morning when the last of the winter snow began to melt beyond the window, Raphael made the greatest decision of his life. He called Giuseppe to his office on the 57th floor that morning. The old advisor entered in his familiar 3-piece suit, his gold-rimmed glasses resting low on his nose, and immediately he sensed the difference in the air. Raphael stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his dark blue eyes watching the city slowly wake. "Giuseppe, I've made my decision. I'm stepping away, completely, from everything tied to the underworld. I will transfer all illegal operations of the family to Don Ferraro across the New Jersey waterfront. He is a man of honor and will handle it properly. I will keep only what is legitimate: the La Rosa Nera restaurant chain, the properties in Manhattan, the shipping company my father built with proper licensing. From now on, I will be a businessman, nothing more." Giuseppe stood in silence for a long moment. The man who had served the Santoro family for nearly 40 years looked at his young master without words. He had imagined this possibility for a long time, had hoped for it in quiet moments, but he had never truly believed it would come. "Are you certain, sir? This is a decision that cannot be undone. Some families will not be pleased. There will be those who think you have become weak. I know, Giuseppe, but I've spent my entire life in the shadows protecting something I can no longer even remember clearly. Now I finally have a reason to step into the light. I won't let Rosalind and Oliver grow up in the same world I did. I won't let our children one day fall asleep fearing their father might never come home." Giuseppe slowly walked toward him. The old advisor, a man always composed and controlled, now felt his eyes grow wet. He reached out his wrinkled hand and held Raphael's. "Do you know something, sir? Your father, Don Alessandro. He always dreamed of a day like this. In the nights before he passed, he told me the only thing he truly wanted for his son was a day when you could leave that world behind, live a normal life with the woman you love and your children. He prayed for it every night, though he never dared to believe it would come true. Today, sir, I am certain he is smiling in heaven." That afternoon, Rosalind came to visit Raphael at his office, as she did every Friday. She carried a bouquet of white roses she had just arranged for the restaurant that evening, and a small box of cookies Oliver had made himself for Raphael. When she heard about his decision, her ash-gray eyes filled with tears. She said nothing for a long moment, only reaching out to hold his hand. Then she took a soft breath and spoke quietly. "Raphael, there's something I want to tell you. I know about the Rose Foundation." He lifted his head, his dark blue eyes widening. "You know, I've known since Oliver was transferred to the hospital. There was a small note in his admission file saying the expenses were covered by a charity called the Rose Foundation, which supports children with congenital heart conditions across the United States. I looked into it. I know it was established 5 years ago, and it has helped more than 2,000 children like Oliver. I know the name Rose isn't a coincidence, is it?" Raphael didn't answer at once. He only raised his hand and gently brushed away a tear from her cheek. When he spoke, his voice was thick. "I always hoped I would find you one day, Rosalind, and I wanted that when I did, you would see that I wasn't entirely a monster, that through all those years, I tried to do something good with the name you left in my heart." Rosalind fell into his arms, and in that embrace, they understood that the past had finally closed behind them, and a new chapter had at last begun. A year had passed over Manhattan, and the seasons had come and gone in its quiet, steady rhythm. That spring had arrived earlier than expected, the cherry blossoms in Central Park blooming by the middle of April and laying a drifting veil of pale pink over the winding paths. Summer had come and gone in warm golden afternoons, and now, with October here, the maple trees in the Long Island countryside had turned brilliant shades of red and orange, stretching across the quiet country roads. like an enormous tapestry woven by autumn's own hands. Rosalind was now 28 years old. She had returned to university the previous fall, enrolling in the landscape design program at Columbia University, a dream she had been forced to set aside for nearly a decade while wandering the streets of Chicago. Her professors had quickly recognized that this young student possessed something rare, an eye that only those who truly understood beauty could ever have. She was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, her table in the Upper East Side apartment piled high with books on plants and landscape design. Oliver had turned 13 and had grown noticeably taller over the past year. After the successful surgery, he had become completely healthy and had returned to the life of an ordinary child. But what made Rosalind prouder than anything else was her brother's love of music. The little piano Raphael had given him in those first days had become his closest companion. Oliver had begun studying with Johannes Breuer, a retired German piano teacher who agreed to give him private lessons after hearing him play for the first time. And just 2 weeks earlier, Oliver had won first prize in New York City's children's piano competition with a piece he had composed himself, a piece he named White Petals, dedicated to his sister. Raphael and Rosalind had moved into a small villa in the Long Island suburbs at the beginning of the summer. The house had been built in the French classical style, with cream sandstone walls, white wooden windows, and a large garden wrapping around 3 sides. Raphael had given up almost all of the punishing schedule that had once belonged to a man like him. Now he only went into his Manhattan office 3 days a week, spending the rest of his time tending the garden with Rosalind, reading by the fireplace, or driving Oliver to his piano lessons. Duke had grown another year older. His brown and black coat now carried a few silver strands around his muzzle, and he was no longer as quick as he had once been. But every morning, when Rosalind stepped out of the bedroom, Duke was always there waiting for her at the door, ears raised in greeting. And every afternoon when she walked through the garden, the loyal Belgian shepherd still kept close at her side, just as he had for nearly 2 years. That morning was a perfect autumn morning. Honey-colored sunlight poured over the back garden, and the white roses in the bushes Rosalind had planted with her own hands in the spring were now in their final bloom of the year. The gentle sweetness of the roses mingled with the scent of dew-damp grass lingering from the night before, creating the kind of air she had always loved. Rosalind was bending down to cut the most beautiful white rose for the vase on the breakfast table when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching behind her. Before she could turn, Raphael placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rosalind." She turned around, and she froze. Raphael was down on one knee on the dew-wet grass of the garden. He wore a simple white shirt and brown trousers, just as he did every morning, but there was none of his usual coldness in his face now. His deep, dark blue eyes were looking at her with an open tenderness he did not try to hide. Resting on his palm was a small black velvet box, already open, and inside it was a gold ring shaped like a rose blossom, with a small diamond set in the center, like a drop of morning dew on a petal. Rosalind lifted her hand to her mouth, tears already filling her ash-gray eyes. "This ring," Raphael said softly, his voice trembling a little, "was made from my father's signet ring. I had a jeweler melt it down and remake it in the shape of a rose, because my father always dreamed of a day like this, and because you are the rose that saved my entire life. Rosalind Whitlock, will you marry me? Will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Rosalind could not speak a single word. She only cried, and nodded again and again, then threw herself into his arms so hard that the two of them nearly fell into the rose bushes. A few yards away, Duke stood with his ears raised high and his gentle amber eyes fixed on his 2 beloved humans, as though he understood that this was the very moment he had been waiting his whole life to witness. The following spring, when the poppy fields of Tuscany and Italy had begun to bloom into endless carpets of crimson stretching across the hills, Raphael and Rosalind's wedding was held at the Santoro family's ancestral estate. The estate stood atop a high hill, surrounded by ancient olive trees hundreds of years old, their silver leaves shimmering in the wind, and vineyards that stretched all the way to the horizon. The ceremony took place outdoors beneath the branches of the oldest olive tree in the garden, one planted by Raphael's grandfather when he laid the first stone of the house nearly 80 years before. Rosalind walked down the white gravel path in a simple silk wedding dress that Isabella Santoro had chosen for her with her own hands. Her chestnut brown hair was braided into a delicate crown adorned with fresh white roses picked from the garden that very morning. As she approached the altar, Isabella was already waiting. The elderly Italian woman, Raphael's mother, had left her quiet life at the estate to welcome her new daughter-in-law. She embraced Rosalind tightly, tears running down her weathered face. "Thank you, my dear girl. You have brought my son back into the light." Father Matthew, who had flown from New York to Italy to officiate the ceremony, smiled gently as he witnessed that moment. He had stood beside Raphael since he was a boy, and he knew that this was the day the late Don Alessandro had dreamed of during the final years of his life. Oliver, now 13 years old and strong and healthy, played a piano piece he had composed especially for the occasion, a piece he called The Journey Home. The soft notes drifted through the olive trees, blending with the Tuscan wind in a way that felt almost magical. Duke, who had traveled with the family on the flight, wore a small white bow at his neck and sat solemnly beside the bride throughout the ceremony, his loyal amber eyes never leaving Rosalind even for a moment. When Raphael slipped the rose-shaped ring onto her finger and spoke his vows beneath the ancient olive tree in the heart of Italy, Rosalind understood that the years of suffering behind her had truly come to an end. Many years later, on the veranda of the old stone house overlooking the Tuscan rose garden, Raphael and Rosalind sat side by side in their familiar wooden chairs. The evening sky in Italy glowed gold, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender from the distant fields. In a corner of the garden, their two young children played together with Duke, the dog now much older, his muzzle almost entirely silver, yet his amber eyes still warm as ever. The older child, a 7-year-old girl with chestnut hair and ash-gray eyes like her mother, was picking white roses for her younger brother. Rosalind held in her hand the last white rose from the garden, its soft petals resting between her fingers. Raphael took her other hand and lifted it to his lips in a gentle kiss. "Do you know, Rosalind, I once believed my life would end in that dark alley in Chicago on that night, but it turns out that was only the beginning of everything beautiful that life had waiting for me." Rosalind smiled, resting her head on his shoulder as she watched their children running around Duke beneath the golden Tuscan sunset. Sometimes in this life, we offer a small act of kindness without ever imagining it could change someone's destiny. A young girl gives a rose to a stranger in a rainy Chicago night. A powerful man stops for a flower seller in a snowy Manhattan evening. Between those two distant moments, God quietly weaves a miracle that no human hand could ever create. Perhaps today you feel that your life has nothing left to give. Perhaps you believe you are too small to change anything at all. But remember this: every act of kindness, no matter how small, is a seed, and only God knows when and where it will bloom, in the life of someone you may never even meet. And sometimes, those seeds become the greatest miracles this world has ever witnessed. If this story has touched your heart today, please leave a like so I know you are here with me on this journey. Don't forget to share it with the people you love, because somewhere out there, someone may need a little hope to believe again in kindness, to believe that miracles still exist in this busy world. And please subscribe and turn on notifications so we can continue walking together through many more meaningful and emotional stories each day. How do you feel about the story of Rosalind and Raphael? What touched your heart the most? Have you ever offered a small act of kindness in your life and only years later realized it changed something important? Leave a comment below and share your story. I would truly love to hear what comes from your heart. Thank you for giving your precious time to listen to this story from beginning to end. I wish you health, joy in your daily life, peace, and happiness always filling your home. Goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next stories.